Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore. Where today we are going to talk about quite the rarity in the old world, namely navies. As, yes, the various major factions, and a fair few minors as well, do indeed have navies. Organized, proper navies with which to expand their own sphere of influence and keep their own, often significant, coastlines and river stretches safe from invaders and simply just roving bands of marauding greenskins. And we will start today with the Bretonian navy, as, frankly, they seem like the nation least likely to actually have a navy. What with their heavy focus on mounted knights and so forth, as cavalry are rarely particularly useful on the high seas. And indeed, the Knights of Bretonnia play a very minor role within the Bretonian navy. For whilst it is technically the king's navy, and the local fleet formations of dukes and noblemen, they are, very unusually so, crewed near exclusively by peasants and commoners. In fact, as far as hierarchy goes, the Bretonian navy is the single most fluid organization in the entire kingdom, where a lowly peasant can rise all the way up to the lofty rank of captain, in command of his very own vessel, and sometimes even fleet formations. Although the command of the actual navy at large, the admirals, will always be Bretonian nobles, even if most of them have never even seen the ocean, much less been on a wooden vessel on the ocean. But hey, details, details. It is blood that makes a commander, after all, not silly-willy knowledge about tides and wind and such other fantasy nonsense. Irrelevancies aside, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it then. The Bretonian navy is organized primarily on a local lord level, with dukes and nobles having their own formations of ships, although this is usually reserved for higher-ranking nobles along the coastline, as the rest really don't have a particular need for a navy. After all, if you're a landlocked lord in the middle of Bretonnia, knights are going to be a far more effective way to demonstrate and expand upon your power and influence than a wooden vessel sat pretty in a farmer's field somewhere. And as for the protection of the rivers of Bretonnia, that is the duty of the royal family, and not those of the lesser dukes and lords. As, of course, the Bretonian Admiralty and its members are no different from the landed knights in that they are bondsmen of the king, Louen Leoncoeur, the Lion-Hearted. And he, at the end of the day, is the supreme master of all Bretonian forces. But even the king can't be everywhere at once, and so he charges his subjects with protecting their own lands, including the coastal provinces, where the Sea Lords, which is one of the titles given to the admirals of the Bretonian navy, carry out their duty with great aplomb, as the Bretonian navy, again somewhat surprisingly, is one of the best in the old world, possessed of fine sailors, excellent shipwrights, and a fantastic artillery park, including hundreds and hundreds of great cannons, which make him as a bit of a surprise, as, of course, we all know the Bretonians themselves, and with that I mean the men of substance, the nobility, the chivalrous heart of Bretonnia. Well, they hate black powder weaponry, largely because if you give a peasant a pistol, well, then he might quickly develop ideas well beyond his status. And there was indeed a time when the Bretonian navy relied entirely on its knights and more archaic contraptions like catapults and ballistas to try and wage war in the chivalrous fashion, even on the high seas, but a couple of humiliating defeats that severely trimmed the rose bushes of Bretonian nobility The Bretonians quickly came to the realization that the more brutish races of the world had a point. Naval warfare was not honorable, was not chivalrous, and should not be treated as if it was. Best leave this particular pursuit to the common folk, who can drown in vast quantities and not overmuch affect the rule of the realm. Now, of course, some safeguards on black powder weaponry must still be instituted across all of Bretonia, and therefore the smallest recognized vessel within the Bretonian navy, the Buccaneer, is not equipped with any gunpowder weaponry, having instead to content itself with things like catapults, maybe a trebuchet if it's extraordinarily lucky, and other bolt-throwing weapons, along with the regular bows and arrows of the Bretonian yeomanry. Now, Buccaneer is not an official designation for a warship. Instead, it is a loose collective term applied to all of the myriad different sizes, shapes, and types of vessels that patrol Bretonia's rivers. These are not, mind you as well, royal vessels, nor are they technically a part of a duke or a lord's navy. They are owned and operated by independent entities, by peasants, civilians, and local mercenaries, whose services are chartered directly by the king himself, and their pay comes directly from the king's purse, ensuring that the waterways of Bretonia are kept safe by Loen Leon Kerr personally. This arrangement is in part so that the local lords inland don't have to bother with the silly nonsense of a navy, and also so as to allow the king complete control over the waterways, which also means complete control over trade, of course, as well, along these vital arteries. And it also allows for the natural training of future Bretonian sailors. See, the Bretonian seaman actually has an excellent reputation across the entirety of the Old World, and it is an extremely popular occupation for Bretonian peasants that have a little bit of a desire for adventure and freedom deep within their souls, as this is pretty much the only way they will ever shake the shackles of feudal society. There is significant benefit in becoming a buccaneer. Not only will you, as a very, very privileged few Bretonian peasants, be allowed to see what's over the next hill, and allowed to leave your land for once, something that you may be the first to do in generations of your family, if not the first ever, but the pay, the privileges, and the possibility of rising up the ranks through merit rather than birth, well, they're all rather unique in Bretonia. That does not mean that life aboard a Buccaneer is at all pleasant, however. Oh, boy, no. Not at all. Service aboard a Buccaneer is often quite cruel, as they are on many occasions crewed not just by hopeful peasantry, whom, if they are particularly lucky, might have other opportunities to join the Bretonian navy, but often also by condemned criminals, convicts, bandits, those who have been given one final opportunity to escape an even harsher punishment. And so Buccaneers are usually captained by some pretty mean motherfuckers, as keeping discipline aboard a ship filled with eager young recruits who know next to nothing about sailing, combined with significant numbers of ne'er-do-wells who really don't want to be here, well, it requires a certain determined touch. To make matters worse, the life of Buccaneers are cheap indeed, as the rest of the Bretonian navy view them as the scum they by and large are, and will not hesitate to sacrifice their lives in significant quantities if it means keeping the enemy at bay from the actually important warships of the Bretonian navy. Still, if a peasant can survive his tour of duty aboard a buccaneer, he might now become a prime candidate for service aboard proper warships. Additionally, the countless trade vessels that ply the rivers and the coastline of Bretonia are always on the lookout for experienced sailors. At least on a trade cog, you've got a decent chance at not being treated too poorly. And hey, so long as you don't get involved in any major sea battles, the primary prey of the buccaneer are merely just sundry greenskin rafts, or the occasional small vessel that has been chartered by other bandits and villainous pirates up and down the coast. Meanwhile, the proper mainstay vessel of the Bretonian navy is referred to as the Corsair, which also indicates one of its primary purposes, which is raiding the coastlines of other peoples. As, yes indeed, the Bretonian navy, which was once based heavily on just simple pirates, by the way, does have a long and proud tradition of raiding other nations, particularly the Empire, and also going on various adventures both to the New World and down south along the coastlines of Kemri and other nations like Araby. Now, much like the Buccaneer, Corsair does not technically refer to a specific type of ship, as local lords might have particular preferences when it comes to the size of the sails, their shape, their position, how many masts a ship will have, how many cannons, and so on, though they are largely limited to 2 decks of cannons, as anything more than that is reserved for a mighty galleon, which can only be crafted at the direct command of the king himself, and obviously the king will want to keep a little bit of monopoly of force as well, naturally. Furthermore, things like the shape and size of Corsairs can also largely be up to the local lord's preference, mounting, for example, large fore and aft castles, so that the Bretonians aboard can fire and throw projectiles down onto the enemy's deck. This sort of quite close-quarters boarding maneuvers, near-boarding maneuvers, perhaps one should rather say, is also a favourite of the Bretonian navy, as it tends to be rather aggressive. In much the same way that the Bretonian knights charge towards the enemy, so do the Bretonian Corsairs charge their enemies as well. Whilst they do possess significant artillery batteries, they are not the kind of warships that are supposed to simply sit at anchor and trade volleys with an enemy at long distance. The Bretonian sailors like to use their expertise as sailors to maneuver effectively in virtually any wind conditions and close with the enemy, ideally in such a way as to slip directly into the enemy's own lines, allowing the Corsair to fire raking shots from both broadsides straight down the front and rear of the enemy vessel's hull. This is, of course, devastating, as the projectile can potentially carry on straight down the entire length of the enemy vessel, causing enormous destruction and killing a lot of the crew, and hopefully disorganizing and demoralizing them. After which, the scattered crew can be picked off by yeomanry archers, or their vessels can be taken in a boarding action, as preferably, of course, ships should be captured whenever possible, as they are very, very, very valuable things. And even the most powerful Bretonian duke is unlikely to have more than a couple Corsairs under his command at any given time. Due to their fairly limited numbers, they are considered rather elite vessels, and are usually crewed by the best and brightest sailors that the Duke commands, and the various flotillas of Corsairs will always be engaged in constant competitions with one another to prove their skill and capabilities in battle, yet again reaffirming the potency of the Bretonian navy through constant competition and one-upmanship. The only vessel larger than the Corsair, and also one of the only vessels actually built to exacting specifications, is the Bretonian galleon. Galleons are only built in the royal shipworks and can only be commissioned by the king himself, and are therefore, of course, also always the property of the king directly, although he has been known to give these vessels to particularly favoured sea lords, and it is a big gift, as the galleon is significantly larger than the Corsair, sporting a third gun deck and massive forward and aft castles. Some of the largest galleons had even been known to carry entire trebuchets on their decks for added firepower. In addition to this, their construction is a near ritualistic endeavor, with only the finest materials being used, and each stage of the process being carefully maintained, overseen, and blessed by experts and Bretonian ladies alike. Each Bretonian galleon, therefore, is not only a work of art, but a holy endeavor as well. When a new galleon is first laid down, this is a massive event, and whoever is about to receive it will no doubt be very, very happy, throwing various feasts and celebration in the honor of the completion of the upcoming vessel. And when it is finally finished, it is considered a national holiday across all of Bretonia, as the new warship's name is officially revealed, and this becomes a source of tremendous pride for the country at large. To the point where even Bretonian peasants, who are famed for knowing very little about anything, usually can be relied upon to be able to name every single galleon currently in service with the Bretonian Navy. As befits such celebrated vessels, only the absolute very finest of sailors and officers are allowed to take command of them, the very cream of the Bretonian Navy's combined crop. And it is, of course, a point of tremendous pride for those selected to man the galleons, both the men-at-arms and those actually operating the vessels, and the artillerists under deck. Obviously, the command of such a vessel can only ever be handed to a proper Bretonian noble, naturally. And, well, this is where we run into a little bit of a problem. All Bretonian warships, Corsairs, and galleons, and obviously all the commanders of fleet formations, must be Bretonian nobles. However, most Bretonian nobles could not care less about naval warfare. They view it, in fact, in many cases as outright dishonorable, as something that they should not engage with, and therefore one might think that they'd make subpar captains, and this is true were it not for the fact that in this case, their lack of care, their absolute disinterest, actually becomes a sort of weirdly perverse strength, as they won't ever need or feel the urge to prove that they are in any way sailors, or that they know or can know anything about this. In fact, a fair few Bretonian nobles will, well, pretty much straight up brag about the fact that they know nothing about the myriad arts of naval navigation, sailing, warfare, tides, currents, winds, artillery, anything at all. It is a good thing for a noble to be actively disinterested in this, and thus they feel no shame whatsoever to simply go, "Hey, you, lowborn captain person, do whatever." And the knight will simply be a galleon figure, in essence. He might be there occasionally. During battles, he's expected to hang out aboard the vessel, maybe with a bodyguard of knights to provide a firm elite core to the close quarters elements of the ship. And make no mistake, Bretonian knights are formidable, even on foot. And if they can actually manage to get onto the enemy vessel, they will be rather dangerous. Now, if it, is too much of a sea going on, they might start vomiting in their helmets, but fortunately, Bretonian galleons are absolutely fucking enormous, frequently referred to as castles on the ocean, so they handle heavy seas pretty damn well. This also, as mentioned, means that a humble Bretonian peasant can, theoretically, technically, rise to command, even if not in name, the mightiest warships in the entirety of Bretonnia, making it quite the vivid dream for many a peasant, and allowing Bretonnia to maintain its traditional noble bearing and demeanour, whilst also still benefiting from an eager and expert crew. And with that, I hope you will now know a little bit more about the Bretonian Navy. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.